The illusion of change. For as long as history remembers, people have placed their faith in the promise of renewal. Every few decades, or sometimes even years, entire nations hold their breath, believing that the next ruler, the next government, the next system will finally deliver what the last one could not. Hope, once again, takes center stage, dressed in new slogans and painted on fresh banners. But beneath the surface, something strange happens. The same society, the same institutions, and often the same people remain. The faces change, the speeches change, the slogans change, but the song stays eerily familiar. We call it progress, reform, revolution. Yet, in essence, it's the repetition of an ancient ritual, the worship of change without transformation. History provides us with countless examples. When the French stormed the Bastille in 1789, they believed they were destroying tyranny once and for all. Within a decade, their revolution, born in the name of liberty, gave rise to Napoleon, another emperor, another hierarchy. After the fall of empires came republics, after dictatorships, democracies. But every new dawn carried within it the same human shadows: greed, fear, corruption, and control. The same story played out in the Arab Spring. What began as a cry for freedom soon descended into chaos, new regimes, and the same old disillusionment. The streets changed, the leaders changed, but the psychology of the people, the expectations of salvation, remained the same. We have always mistaken movement for progress. We repaint the walls of the same collapsing house and call it a new home. The reason this illusion persists is not merely political, it is psychological. Humans are wired to look outward for solutions to inner dissatisfaction. When life feels unbearable, when systems feel unjust, when the future feels uncertain, we cling to symbols of external change because they promise relief without self-confrontation. Psychologists call it projection, the tendency to cast our personal frustrations onto the world around us. We imagine that our suffering stems from corrupt leaders, flawed systems, or broken laws. But in doing so, we avoid the harder truth that the roots of dysfunction often lie within us, reflected through our collective behavior. Then, there is the external locus of control, a concept describing how people attribute outcomes to forces beyond their influence. Believing that they are in charge, governments, corporations, elites, allows us to feel safe in our helplessness. We surrender our agency in exchange for comfort, and in doing so, we unconsciously maintain the very systems we claim to despise. Hope, too, plays its role in this cycle. Hope is not inherently bad. It's essential for survival. But when hope becomes a substitute for action, it transforms into a psychological trap. Hope keeps us waiting. Hope convinces us that the next election, the next revolution, the next leader will redeem our pain. And so, generation after generation, people gather to celebrate new beginnings without realizing they are standing on the ruins of old ones. Every new government promises renewal. Every manifesto declares that this time will be different. But societies rarely collapse because of their leaders alone. They collapse because people forget how to live with integrity, how to think critically, how to resist the seduction of apathy. Nietzsche once warned that humanity's greatest problem is not evil, but comfort, the tendency to choose illusion over awakening. We prefer to believe that replacing faces will somehow replace our nature. We want revolution without introspection, freedom without responsibility, progress without pain. This is the illusion of change, the comforting story that history tells us to avoid confronting ourselves. Because real transformation is terrifying. It demands more than a vote or a slogan. It demands that individuals change how they think, how they live, and how they participate in society. It requires that we question not only the system, but also our role in perpetuating it. When that courage is absent, politics becomes a carousel. Leaders rise and fall, parties trade power, but the landscape remains the same. We mistake the spin for forward motion, never realizing we've been circling the same point all along. And so the cycle continues. The masses wait, again, for a new government, a new savior, a new illusion. Because to wait is easier than to act. To hope is easier than to change. Until one day, someone finally asks, what if the problem was never the government? What if the problem was us? The psychology of dependence. Beneath every political system lies something older, deeper, and more primal than any constitution or ideology: the human need to depend on authority. It is a need so ingrained, so unconscious, that it shapes the way societies rise and fall. Governments may promise order, stability, and security, but behind those promises lies a subtle psychological truth. Most people do not truly want freedom. They want protection. To understand this, we must first look at human development itself. The first years of life are defined by dependency. As children, we survive only through the care of figures stronger and wiser than us, our parents. In this stage, obedience is safety and submission is survival. Over time, we grow older, but psychologically, many never leave that state. We simply replace our parents with new symbolic figures: teachers, bosses, leaders, and eventually, governments. The mind adapts, but the emotional script remains the same. Someone else will take care of it. Erich Fromm, the German psychoanalyst, called this phenomenon the fear of freedom. In his view, true freedom terrifies the average person because it demands self-responsibility. It removes the comforting illusion that someone else has control. And so, to escape the burden of choice, people willingly trade liberty for guidance. They obey authority not out of trust, but out of psychological necessity. This is why the language of politics often mirrors the language of family. Governments protect their citizens, care for their people, provide for their needs. The state becomes the ultimate parent, punishing, rewarding, forgiving. In turn, the population becomes infantilized, dependent, reactive, emotional. It demands solutions but resists accountability. It wants both freedom and shelter, both independence and control. The result is a silent social contract based not on mutual respect, but on mutual dependency. The government needs obedient citizens. The citizens need a governing parent. And together, they sustain a loop of submission disguised as order. This dependency extends beyond politics. It infiltrates how we think, work, and even believe. People follow experts, influencers, and ideologies with the same devotion once reserved for gods and kings. They seek certainty in a world that offers none, and in that search, they willingly surrender the very agency that could set them free. The philosopher Carl Jung saw this clearly. He believed that the modern individual suffers from a profound spiritual weakness, a disconnection from their own inner authority. When that inner compass fails, people look outward for structure. The stronger the inner chaos, the greater the need for outer control. This is why societies in crisis often become more authoritarian. When fear spreads, when uncertainty grows, people crave order at any cost. They welcome the strong leader, the firm hand, the illusion of control. They call it leadership, but it is often dependency disguised as loyalty. And yet, what is dependency but a quiet form of bondage? When we rely too deeply on authority, we stop cultivating the muscles of independence, critical thinking, resilience, moral courage. Like atrophied limbs, these qualities weaken over time, leaving us more helpless, more compliant, and more easily manipulated. The tragic irony is that governments do not create dependency, people do. Authority exists because we invite it. Power thrives because we feed it. Every tyrant, every corrupt leader, every manipulative system survives only with the cooperation of the governed. Fromm once said, "Man does not suffer so much from the fact that he must work, but from the fact that he must obey." Yet the deeper suffering is not obedience to authority. It is obedience to our own fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of chaos. Fear of freedom itself. And so we cling to authority like children clutching the hands of their parents in the dark, even when that hand leads us in circles. We tell ourselves it's safer this way. That structure keeps us civilized. But in truth, dependency is not civilization. It's paralysis. Until we confront this inner need to be ruled, no system, no revolution, no democracy will ever truly liberate us. We will simply trade one ruler for another, one illusion for the next. Because as long as we fear our own freedom, someone will always rise to rule us. The machinery of belief. Once dependence takes root, it does not need force to survive. It only needs belief. And belief, more than law or weapon, is what sustains every government, every revolution, every empire. Throughout history, power has always relied on a single invisible tool, the ability to shape what people perceive as truth. Rulers rise and fall, but belief endures. Belief in progress, in security, in national destiny, in the idea that those who lead do so for our good. It is this machinery of belief that turns the abstract into the unquestionable. From ancient monarchs who claim divine right to modern leaders who claim moral superiority, the mechanism is the same. Authority wraps itself in a story, and people, hungry for meaning, accept it. The philosopher Gustave Le Bon observed that crowds do not think, they feel. A crowd is not moved by reason, but by rhythm. It needs symbols, slogans, and emotion. It needs to believe. Political systems have mastered this rhythm. Every flag, anthem, and speech is a calculated act of emotional design, transforming individuals into a collective consciousness that can be led, directed, or pacified. Modern governments understand this better than ever. They no longer rely on censorship alone. They rely on narrative control. In democracies, information flows freely, but it flows through invisible channels of persuasion, through headlines, algorithms, and framing. The illusion of choice is preserved, but the boundaries of acceptable thought are carefully drawn. Edward Bernays, the father of modern propaganda, once wrote that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. What he meant was that freedom without guidance terrifies the public. And so, belief must be managed, curated, and fed, not by dictators, but by experts, institutions, and media. It's not conspiracy, it's psychology. The machinery of belief operates because it must. A population that questions everything cannot be governed. A population that believes in everything cannot be free. So a balance is maintained. Enough illusion to inspire trust, enough doubt to sustain debate, but never enough truth to ignite rebellion. This is why every era invents its own vocabulary of virtue: democracy, security, progress, justice. Words that sound universal, but mean whatever power needs them to mean. Through repetition, they become sacred. Through emotion, they become unquestionable. When fear spreads, the machinery accelerates. A crisis erupts, and immediately a narrative follows. "We will protect you." The population complies, believing that order is being restored, when in truth, belief is being reinforced. And thus, we find ourselves trapped in an endless exchange. Obedience disguised as unity, manipulation disguised as hope. Governments don't need to control every mind. They only need to shape the context in which minds operate. They don't need to silence every critic. They only need to drown them in noise. The most effective propaganda is not a lie we are told, but a truth we never question. When the machinery of belief functions perfectly, citizens mistake stability for freedom and compliance for peace. They continue to believe that power is external, not realizing that the greatest control is the one we willingly participate in. The belief that we need to be governed in order to exist. This is the quiet genius of modern control. People do not feel oppressed. They feel safe. They do not feel censored. They feel informed. They do not feel manipulated. They feel patriotic. And when belief becomes comfort, the machinery no longer needs to be enforced. It sustains itself. Because once people choose to believe, no one needs to command them to obey. The myth of the collective savior. Every era tells the same story with different names. The story of the savior, a figure who will rise, cleanse corruption, restore balance, and guide humanity toward redemption. Sometimes he wears a crown, sometimes a suit, sometimes a revolutionary smile. But the myth remains unchanged, that salvation will come from above. From Moses leading his people through the desert, to kings claiming divine right, to modern presidents promising a new beginning, the savior archetype is one of humanity's oldest psychological structures. It offers hope, purpose, and a way to organize chaos. But it also carries a dangerous illusion that the collective can be healed without individuals changing themselves. The myth persists because it soothes our deepest insecurity, the fear of insignificance. We want to believe that someone else holds the blueprint to meaning, that if we just follow the right leader, ideology, or party, our suffering will be justified. The savior myth transforms power into something sacred. It sanctifies authority and relieves us of responsibility. When people lose faith in gods, they do not stop believing. They simply find new idols. Religion gave way to nationalism, nationalism to ideology, ideology to politics. But the structure remains the same. A chosen figure who embodies the collective dream, who speaks for the voiceless, who promises deliverance. In the ancient world, kings were seen as intermediaries between man and the divine. In the modern world, politicians serve as intermediaries between the citizen and the illusion of control. Both offer the same bargain, obedience in exchange for salvation. We have replaced God with government and confession with opinion polls. This substitution is subtle, almost invisible. People no longer pray to divine powers for rain or prosperity. They vote for them. The ballot box has become the altar of modern faith. We enter the booth, cast our prayers, and wait for miracles in the form of policy. But what happens when the Savior fails? History answers that question mercilessly. Every leader, no matter how charismatic or visionary, eventually becomes the villain in another generation's story. The redeemer of one era becomes the oppressor of the next, because the myth demands failure. The Savior cannot save. He can only reset the illusion. The tragedy lies not in the leader's corruption, but in the people's expectation. We ask too much of those we elevate, and too little of ourselves. We demand moral perfection from others while tolerating our own complacency. We outsource virtue, courage, and conscience, and then lament when they are not returned to us. The Savior myth survives because it offers comfort. It absolves us of the unbearable truth that freedom is a burden, that meaning is something we must build, not receive. And so we wait for the next election, the next hero, the next new era, each time believing that this time will be different, each time mistaking a changing face for changing fate. The myth endures because it is not about politics, it is about psychology. It speaks to something ancient in the human heart, the longing to be led, the yearning to be rescued from the weight of our own potential. But perhaps salvation has never been collective at all. Perhaps the true Savior is the individual who refuses to wait, who decides that change does not descend from the top, but rises quietly from within. Until that realization spreads, the myth will live on. Because as long as people hope to be saved, there will always be someone ready to save them. History's repetition. History, when stripped of its dates and banners, is nothing more than a recurring dream. A dream of salvation, power, collapse, and rebirth. Each generation believes it is different from the last. Each imagines it has broken free from the failures of those who came before. And yet, if we listen closely, we can hear the echo of the same footsteps, marching in circles across the centuries. Empires rise on promises of justice. They build monuments to freedom, libraries of law, and parades of virtue. Then, slowly, the cracks appear. Greed seeps into the veins of prosperity. Power centralizes. Corruption grows subtle, then bold. The citizens begin to lose faith, not suddenly, but quietly, through exhaustion. Soon, a new movement emerges, one that claims to restore what has been lost. Flags change, anthems shift, leaders are replaced, but the structure remains the same. The revolution, like the system it destroys, begins to age the moment it takes power. Consider Rome, once a republic built on civic duty and restraint. Over centuries, it transformed into an empire ruled by decadence and control. When it fell, the world promised it would never repeat that mistake. Yet centuries later, France, England, Russia, America, each would follow their own version of the same pattern. Every ideal, when worshipped too long, hardens into its opposite. Liberty becomes control. Equality becomes conformity. Justice becomes vengeance. The pendulum swings endlessly because human nature itself rarely changes. We often assume that history is a linear progression, that humanity is moving toward enlightenment, that technology and education will save us from our darker instincts. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Every technological leap brings new tools of manipulation. Every enlightenment gives rise to new forms of ignorance. The problem is not in the systems we create, but in the psychology that sustains them. As individuals, we are driven by the same primitive forces, fear, pride, envy, desire, that ruled our ancestors. We dress them in modern language, but the essence remains the same. We call it policy instead of conquest, strategy instead of greed, security instead of domination. Civilizations collapse not because of sudden catastrophe, but because of slow decay, moral, intellectual, and spiritual. They rot from within long before they are conquered from without. And when they finally fall, we mourn the structures, not the values that eroded long ago. Then, inevitably, the cycle begins again. A new movement arises, claiming to have learned from history. It denounces the corruption of the old and promises renewal. The people, weary yet hopeful, follow once more. But revolutions rarely rewrite the human condition. They simply rearrange it. The oppressed become the rulers. The idealists become bureaucrats. The dreamers become the enforcers of new dogmas. The pattern endures because it is not political. It is psychological. Humanity's greatest enemy is not tyranny, but forgetfulness. Each generation forgets that power corrupts, that freedom demands vigilance, and that progress is never permanent. The collapse of empires begins not in parliaments, but in the human soul. And so, history becomes a mirror, showing us not where we've been, but who we still are. The lesson is always the same, yet rarely learned. Until human beings change their relationship with power, morality, and responsibility, the cycle will continue, endlessly, beautifully, tragically, repeating itself under new names, new flags, and the same familiar hope that this time it will be different. The age of personal revolution. After every collapse, after every wave of disappointment, humanity finds itself staring at the same haunting question. If no government can fix us, what can? For centuries, we've searched for salvation through external revolutions, political, technological, economic. Yet the world remains trapped in the same psychological loops. Every new era promises liberation, and everyone ends in a new form of dependence. Perhaps it's because we have misunderstood what revolution truly means. Real revolution is not the burning of buildings or the rewriting of constitutions. It is the quiet, personal act of reclaiming ownership over one's mind, one's choices, and one's life. This is the age of personal revolution, not fought in streets or parliaments, but in consciousness itself. For too long, we have been conditioned to believe that the world's dysfunction is separate from our own. We complain about greed while living in consumption. We despise corruption, yet practice dishonesty in small ways. We blame manipulation while eagerly surrendering our attention to those who sell it. The system, it seems, is not some distant machine. It is a reflection of the human spirit that built it. The Stoics understood this long before politics became a profession. They taught that power over the self is the only true power. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor himself, wrote in his Meditations that a man's worth is no greater than the worth of his ambitions. He ruled an empire, yet his philosophy turned inward, not toward conquest, but toward self-mastery. Modern society, however, teaches the opposite. It rewards outrage over reflection, appearance over authenticity. We are encouraged to point fingers, to find villains, to seek validation from the very systems we criticize. This is not revolution, it is distraction. True revolution begins the moment a person decides to stop waiting for a savior, for reform, for permission. It begins when one realizes that transformation is not collective until it is personal. A society changes when its individuals awaken, one by one, to their own responsibility. This awakening is not easy. Freedom never is. It demands the courage to question everything, not just authority, but also one's own motives, fears, and contradictions. It demands that we step out of the comfort of victimhood and confront the uncomfortable reality that we are complicit in the very systems we condemn. The modern individual is surrounded by noise, algorithms, opinions, ideologies, each claiming to offer truth. But the real battle is internal, to reclaim silence, to think for oneself, to discern rather than react. In a world designed to capture attention, awareness itself becomes an act of rebellion. The personal revolution is not about isolation or cynicism. It is about rediscovering agency. It's about realizing that moral courage, integrity, and compassion are political forces in their own right, that a single honest act carries more weight than 1,000 empty protests. Every movement that ever changed the world began not with crowds, but with individuals who refused to conform to decay. Socrates questioning the masses, Gandhi refusing to retaliate, Solzhenitsyn choosing truth over safety. Each understood that personal transformation is contagious. It ripples outward, unsettling the comfortable and awakening the dormant. In this age, rebellion no longer means defying the system. It means outgrowing it. To outgrow it is to refuse the seduction of outrage, to act with purpose rather than impulse, to see politics not as the source of virtue, but as its reflection. When enough people embody this, societies evolve naturally. No elections, no revolts, no revolutions, just a quiet, undeniable shift in consciousness. Perhaps this is what real change looks like. Not the sound of crowds, but the silence of awakening minds. The age of personal revolution is not something to wait for. It has already begun. It begins wherever one person decides to stop being governed by fear, dependence, or apathy. Because the greatest political act is not to demand freedom, but to become free. Conclusion: the silent revolution. And so we return to where we began, to the endless waiting. Generation after generation, people gather around the same flame of hope, expecting that someday someone will arrive to make things right. They call it progress, democracy, destiny. But beneath all these names lies the same desire: to be saved. Yet maybe salvation was never meant to come from above. Maybe it was always meant to begin below, quietly, invisibly within us. The truth is both liberating and uncomfortable. No government can fix a people who refuse to fix themselves. Systems do not decay on their own. People decay, and systems follow. When greed, apathy, and ignorance spread through millions of hearts, they manifest as the corruption, chaos, and deceit we see in the world. The government is only the mirror. We are the reflection. We have mistaken management for leadership, politics for morality, and belief for awareness. We have outsourced responsibility for so long that we've forgotten what it means to be self-governing in the truest sense. Freedom has never been about the absence of rulers. It has always been about the presence of consciousness. The silent revolution begins not with protests or power struggles, but with a question. What if the world changes when I do? It begins when a person chooses honesty over comfort, curiosity over certainty, and action over complaint. It grows when individuals start building integrity in the places where no one is watching. It spreads when people realize that a healthy society is not voted into existence. It is lived into existence. This revolution is not televised. It does not trend. It has no anthem, no flag, no leader. It moves through conversations, through choices, through the quiet rebellion of those who think, feel, and act with awareness. The world doesn't need more saviors. It needs more awakened individuals. People who understand that freedom is not granted, it's practiced, that morality is not imposed, it's cultivated, that progress is not a movement, it's a mindset. Because once enough people awaken, governments will no longer be the architects of society. They will be its reflection. Maybe that is the real reason why history keeps repeating. Not because we are doomed to forget, but because we are still learning to remember that power begins where dependency ends, and that the most profound revolutions often happen in silence. Maybe we've been waiting for the wrong kind of revolution. Not the one that replaces faces in power, but the one that replaces fear with responsibility. And when that revolution comes, not with noise, but with awareness, humanity may finally understand that the only government truly capable of saving us has always been the one within.